We're continuing with the series that we're doing for the month of March, talking about Unity's unique take on Lent. And we're going to be working with ideas from two books. One is Keep a True Lent by Charles Fillmore, and the other is a more modern book, The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. So last week, I talked a little bit about how our version of Lent in Unity differs somewhat from the traditional Lent that I learned about when I was in Catholic school. I went to Catholic school from grade 1 all the way through, sophomore in college or something like that. And when I was young, I was taught that we were supposed to fast during Lent and give up something that we liked. And the way the sisters explained it to me, the way I recall it, is that we were in some small way, by giving up something and by fasting and going a little hungry, we were going to be experiencing this mild form of suffering that would help us to identify with the suffering of Jesus. That is one of the big stories that Lent and Easter is all about. In fact, I remember them telling me about what some children would do. Some children would put like a sharp stone in their shoe, we were told, so that when they walked around it would pinch or hurt a little bit or be uncomfortable. Or then there were these old tales going around about people who would wear burlap t-shirts underneath. You know, it would be itchy and kind of scratchy and stuff like that. And I thought it was interesting. I never did any of those things, but I remember the stories going around. And years later, when I was studying Buddhism, I got a whole different perspective on things. Because, you know, in Buddhism, one of the highest ideals is something that they call a person that they call a bodhisattva. Bodhisattva is someone who's attained enlightenment, but then chooses to go out into the world to help to alleviate the suffering of everyone else. So Buddhism was just the opposite of what I had been learning about spirituality when I was growing up. In Buddhism, the goal of spirituality is to try to help alleviate suffering rather than, create more, even if it's just a mild form of suffering. And then not too long after that, I heard about how Unity talks about Lent. And so this is from the foreword to Keep a True Lent. And this was written by a woman named Georgiana Tree West, who was the lead minister at the big Unity Church in New York back in the 1930s. So here's what she says. She says, "Each one of us must be concerned with improving his own life. We must learn to deny our selfish impulses and be obedient to impulses of brotherly love. When we withdraw our attention, interest, and support from the false and the unworthy, this is true fasting. When we give that same attention, interest, and support to the enduring good, we are feasting on the things of spirit, and this is true prayer." So that's quite a switch from what I learned when I was growing up. Withdrawing our attention from the false and the unworthy and focusing instead on the true, the good, and the beautiful. Fasting from negative thinking and putting something positive and life-affirming in its place. And Lent is only about 46 days long, which isn't nearly enough time to explore all of the ways that we have available to us to try to deal with our habitual forms of negative thinking. That's something we should be doing every single day of the year, which is what we emphasize here. And yet, it's always a good idea to set aside a time to renew our intention and to sharpen our focus on this kind of practice of substituting the negative, substituting something affirmative and positive for the negative and the unworthy. And Lent gives us a great opportunity to do just that. So, today we're going to look at words. Our language, the words that we use, are some of the best indicators of what's going on at the level of consciousness. Talk is not cheap. Our words contain the contents of our thoughts. They reflect what's going on in consciousness. So, the words we use, the language that we use, are always a good starting point for practicing self-awareness. Learning how to see all of the ways that our habitual, limited thinking comes out in the form of certain words and language that we use. Seeing that and then replacing it with something better. I find words fascinating. I am absolutely fascinated by words. They say that there are 846,627 words in the English language. That has to be plus or minus a handful, I guess. It's, it's an S. I don't know, how do they come up with that stuff? Somebody sits there and counts words. That's a lot of words, and that's just the English language. There are like 7,300 other languages and dialects out there in the world, so there are a lot of words floating around in our world. And I have to say, I really admire people who are multilingual or even just bilingual. And I'm talking about people who can actually think and speak in another language, not just a few swear words. You know why? Why is it? Why is it that just about everybody can cuss in another language, even if they can't speak any of the language fluently? What's that all about? You know? I remember when that. Never mind. I learned Spanish, and the only words I remember. Language is a funny thing, you know. Language is filled with internal inconsistencies and contradictions. It's amazing that we can communicate. For example, a boxing ring is square. There's no egg in eggplant. There's no ham in hamburger. A pineapple contains neither pine nor apples. Sweet meats are candies, while sweet breads, which aren't sweet, are meat. And why is it that writers write, but fingers don't fing? Grocers, they don't gross. Hammers don't ham. If the plural of tooth is teeth, then why isn't the plural of booth beef? I don't get it. One goose, two geese, so it stands to reason that if one moose is a moose, then two should be meese. You got it. They were on the same page here. Huh? Now here's one that hits close to home. If we say that a teacher taught, then why don't preachers prot? If vegetarians eat vegetables, what does a humanitarian eat? You recite at a play, you play at a recital. In our language, you can have a nose that runs and feet that smell. How can a slim chance and a fat chance be the same thing while a wise man and a wise guy are opposites? I don't get it. So as we've just seen, words can be entertaining. They can make us laugh. They can make us cry. I didn't hear any crying, but there were a few groans during that. Words truly can paint wonderful pictures, and poetry and literature can evoke the entire range of human emotions, from anger to compassion, from sorrow to joy. So words are powerful things. You've heard the old saying that the pen is mightier than the sword. And there's a corollary to that also. It's also a lot easier to write with. Okay. But seriously now, folks, consider the book of Genesis, a milestone in the evolution of human consciousness. Truly, this ancient Hebrew book, thousands of years old, tells an ancient creation myth that is different from every other creation myth that was around at the time. Other creation myths, creation occurred as a result of battles and violence. In Genesis, God literally speaks the universe into existence using words. Let there be light, dry land, so on and so forth. And then the Creator calls it good. So creation begins with words. And then we come to, from Genesis, we go to the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John. which begins with its very own version of that same creation story. You might remember these words. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. So there we have that word theme happening again. John was written in Greek, and the Greek word that gets translated as word is this one here. Logos is the word that's used. Logos. And logos is a concept in ancient Greek philosophy that doesn't just mean word the way we think of it. It means that, but there's a technical meaning that goes a lot deeper. The technical meaning is that it is not just the word, it's also the principle of order and knowledge that goes behind that word. And those of you who want to do extra credit, go home and look up Heraclitus, who kind of coined this whole thing back in the days of the ancient Greek philosophers. The logos, a principle of order and knowledge. So if we take that word and rework that line from the Gospel of John, it might sound like this. In the beginning was a principle of order and knowledge by which all things have come into being. And we can call that principle of order and knowledge God. Wow. So, this is what happens when we delve into the power of words and go beyond just the superficial meaning of these things. That's what we're talking about. That's what the ancient Hebrew culture was getting at with the power of words. That's what the ancient Greek culture was getting at with the power of words. So, in the language of Genesis and John, we want to use our words in such a way that they reflect that power. We want to use our words in such a way that whatever we create with our words can be called good. That's the goal, because it can go both ways, as we know. In the book, The Four Agreements, the very first agreement that he talks about is be impeccable with your word. The author says that our words are like a sword with two edges. He says one edge is the misuse of the word, which creates a living hell. The other edge is the impeccability of the word, which will only create beauty, love, and heaven on earth. Now, years before that, in his book Dynamics for Living, our co-founder Charles Fillmore said it like this. He says, every word has its effect, though unseen and unrecognized. What we think, we usually express in words. Our words bring about in our life and affairs whatever we put into them. A weak thought is followed by words of weakness. Through the law of expression and form, words of weakness change to weakness the character of everything that receives them. Negative thoughts followed by negative words, and through the law of expression and form, negative words will create more negative experiences for us and often for people who are around us. So that's why we want our words to be life-affirming, positive. Now, last November, we talked about a way to evaluate our words, which I think works beautifully and it bears repeating. If we want to make sure that our words are creating beauty and order instead of misery and chaos, that hell on earth, we can ask three questions. Is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? So let's start with the first question. Is it true? At a very simple level, that means that I will not present anything as true that I know is false. All right, but is it really that easy? Is it enough to just refrain from outright lies? What about asserting my opinion as a fact instead of just a personal preference? What about recirculating stuff in an email or sharing things on Facebook as true without checking it out first on Snopes. You know, there's somebody who once said, Google is your friend. And sometimes it helps to check things out before we send things out there into the world without really knowing whether they've been checked out and whether they really stand up to scrutiny or not. And boy, doesn't that stuff go around? You ever get something on Facebook or in your email, you read it, and you think, well, geez, that can't be right. Check it out, and sure enough, you know, there's a problem. So that's one of the things we're looking at when we ask that question. Is it true? And even if something is true, and let's say that it's necessary, we'll get to that in a minute, but even if it's true and necessary, what tone do we take when we communicate? That's an important piece of it too. Is it kind? The example I like to use is if I'm in a restaurant, I order a steak medium well, and it's still raw in the middle, it's perfectly okay for me to send that steak back and ask for another one. However, if I call the chef a careless buffoon or something along those lines, I'm running afoul of the second question. That's not kind. We can communicate what is true and necessary with kindness that doesn't detract from the need to make that communication, to make it clearly. Sometimes I think kindness helps people to listen a little bit better, helps us to communicate more clearly. On the other hand, something can be true and packaged with kindness, but does the world really need to hear what we have to say about every little thing? I said earlier, talk isn't cheap. Words are powerful. The reason why people say that talk is cheap comes down to basic economics, and we all know this, right? The price of something goes down when supply exceeds demand. So talk becomes cheap when the supply of talk exceeds the demand. It's that simple. Don't we live in a world where everyone seems to think that they're entitled to tell everyone else what they think? In fact, it's worse than that. It's like we think that everyone needs to hear what we have to say or think about just about everything. If any of you read the news online, if you read the news online, you've probably noticed that most stories allow people to post comments. Now I'm going to share a very valuable piece of advice that will lead to greater peace of mind and serenity for everyone here. Never, ever read the comments. There are people out there who specialize, they're called trolls. They specialize in writing inflammatory comments that are meant to be totally contrarian to the point being made in an attempt to draw people into verbal fights online. Do not read the comments. In fact, if you want to give up something for Lent, stop reading the comments section. All right, so something that's, we may have some question about whether anybody needs to hear my opinion or my comment, but something that's never necessary is gossip. Gossip and a form of complaining that's called kvetching. reaching back into our Hebrew brothers and sisters, a Yiddish word. Don't you love Yiddish words? I love Yiddish words. I love the sound of Yiddish words. Kvetch. Just from the sound of it, you know that's not something that's very flattering. A kvetch, a chronic whiner and complainer. They're not trying to change anything for the better. They just like to complain. Nobody likes a kvetch. Maya Angelou once said, if you don't like something, change it. If you can't change it, change your attitude. Don't kvetch or complain. Wise words. One final thought. Being impeccable with our word doesn't equal stuffing our feelings. I understand that sometimes we have these internal things going on that we need to get out and to put into words somewhere, somehow. It's about becoming aware of those feelings. We don't stuff them, we become more aware of them, so much so that we learn to see the negative feelings, the negative thoughts before they come out in the form of words and action. So we all get frustrated, right? We all get irritated, fed up, angry. And if we need to engage in a righteous rant, journal. It's a great way to do it. Write it down in a journal. Craft it exactly the way you want to see it with all of your righteous indignation. Don't share it with anyone necessarily. Or take it to your therapist or take it to your minister or something like that and talk to them about it, because that's what we're here for, is to help you with these things. And even though there are people out there who are used to hearing a lot of gossip and complaining, bartenders, barbers, hairdressers, they don't count. That's kvetching, okay? Another caution is to not expect to get it perfect right away. It's part of the human condition. We've been trained to be less than impeccable with our words. To quote the great rock and roll sage Joe Walsh, once said, "Lucky I'm sane after all I've been through. I can't complain, but sometimes I still do. Life's been good to me so far." Life's been good. So why do we still complain? I don't know. I can't complain, but sometimes I still do. So maybe this is a shorthand way to be impeccable with our word. Simply affirm that, basically, life is good. Life is good. Look for all of the evidence that supports that affirmation, that life is good. Life is good. Now, what can I say about that? Because everything else is just bupkis, which is another Yiddish word which means simply nothing of value. See you next week. Thank you.